So one of the requirements of the personal essay or college application essay unit is to read two or three of your classmates' drafts and give each of them some thoughtful, constructive feedback. Um, so that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. How to do that, how to do that well, how to do it in a way that works for you and for them. Um, Now, before we get into that, I just want to address the elephant in the room because often when I do peer review with students, especially if it's the first peer review workshop, there is some eye rolling, maybe some groaning, some heavy sighing, feelings like, oh, why do we have to do peer review, workshops? They're pointless, right? Why? What can my classmates tell me? How can they help me be a better writer? They're a student just like me, right? That's what the teacher's there for. Um, And I think that oftentimes those complaints are probably pretty well justified. Um, Over the years, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been doing workshops for a long time in lots of different classes, and I like to start workshops just by talking about reasons why they often don't work, or when they don't work, why is that? And we don't have the benefit of being together in a class to really have that conversation. But I do want to share with you guys um, some of the main reasons why students tend to complain about workshops um, that have kind of stood out for me over the years. So um, one of the main ones that students often complain about is that their classmates, when they read and comment on their work, they're only correcting the spelling and punctuation or the grammar. Like they're just basically looking for typos, for those mechanical mistakes, and then they maybe suggest some edits, and that's it. Okay. Um, and now those things can be very helpful, but usually when we're at the peer review stage, we have bigger, as writers, we have bigger concerns. We're not really thinking about that, or we know that there's spelling mistakes and punctuation errors, and we're planning to go over those later. So it's not particularly helpful to just have those things pointed out. Um, Another reason that often comes up is that classmates will just read it and just give praise. You know, um, I'll say, "Wow, I really like this a lot." Especially with personal narrative essays, it can be challenging to offer critical feedback when they're telling a story about their life, and sometimes maybe it's a painful story. So how do you critique that, right? Um, and praise is good. I'll say this: praising the writer, like saying, "Wow, this is a really powerful story. This really moved me." That's good. Writers like to hear that, but they also want to know what they could do better, or they want to know why something was really effective. Why did you like that paragraph, and that sort of thing. That brings me to the next point. The comments. One of the complaints students often have about workshops is that the comments they get are just really vague. Wow, I really like this a lot. Great job. Or maybe you might get something like just fix up the intro a bit and you're good. I really wouldn't change anything. Maybe just do some proofreading before you turn it in. And you know, again, praise is great and suggestions are really important, but these kinds of comments aren't actually all that helpful because they're not specific. Right? What did you like a lot? What did I do well? You like that paragraph, great. What did you like about it? Why did you think it was effective? You told me to fix up the intro a bit, but why? What sort of work does it need? What was it missing? And that kind of thing. And then lastly, um, I think one of the most common complaints that I also tend to hear from students is that um, sometimes it feels like their classmates, when they're reading and commenting on the essay, it's like they're trying to take over and rewrite the essay as they think it should be written. Right? You should do this. You should write it this way. You should include this and so forth. And I'll address that one directly in just a little bit. But that never feels good, right? Like you're giving somebody, especially if it's a first draft, you want to know what they think of it. But then when they kind of take over and try to make it into something that they think it should look like, That just doesn't feel good. So we'll talk about that in just a sec. So um, I just again want to say, if you've ever had any of these complaints, or maybe you're thinking about these right now, I hear you, and oftentimes they're valid. And I think, and I'm gonna, I hate to say this, but I think one of the main reasons why this sort of stuff happens is because teachers either don't know how to structure a workshop for students, or what they call a workshop, what students and teachers think is a peer review workshop, is really more of just like an exercise in editing. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about right now. There's a difference between peer review and peer editing. Okay, peer editing is, as the word editing suggests, it tends to focus mostly on the sentence level stuff, or maybe sometimes paragraph or organization, but really it's looking at the mechanics of the essay, and trying to kind of tidy things up a bit before it gets turned in. The goal with peer editing usually is to correct the work. Okay, it's to catch those things that maybe the writer hasn't seen, and just fix them up. All right. Peer editing is usually done, or if not, it's best done with a draft that's kind of nearly ready to be turned in. So that right before you turn it in, maybe give it to somebody and say, "Hey, can you look this over and check for any spelling errors or grammatical errors?" One thing I do recommend is that you give it to somebody else and have them read it out loud, even to you, because and I don't really have time to get into this right now, but that method works the best for catching those errors. We tend to not see the errors, like spelling errors and grammatical errors, when we write, because we know what it's supposed to sound like in our heads. So even when we read it out loud, we sometimes don't catch those. So just before you submit your final draft, maybe just give that to somebody else in your house and say, "Hey, read this out loud to me," to catch some of those errors. But that's all that work is really in the peer editing stage, and that's not where we're at right now. Okay, we're not working with a nearly final draft; we're working with a first draft, and that's where peer review can be helpful. Peer review, unlike peer editing, focuses on bigger things. It focuses on the ideas. Okay, the information as a whole. If you're writing an argumentative essay, right, you want to know if the argument is strong. Okay, you don't want to know if your spelling is good. You want to know, like, gosh, am I making a good point here? If you're writing a personal narrative essay, right, you want to know, hey, do I have a point? Is my point clear? Is my story leading up to that point? Is it connected to that point, right? Or in the story, do I have enough detail? Do I have too much detail, right? So in other words, like, is it working? Is it successful? Is the idea getting across? And if it's not, where does that breakdown happen? The goal of peer review isn't to correct the work. Okay, it isn't to tidy things up. It's to help the writer understand how their work is being read and received. Okay, and that's actually gonna go right into, I think, the first strategy that I have for you guys here. But guys, listen very carefully to this. As a peer reviewer, when you are reading and responding to your classmate's essay, you are not an editor. You're not a grader. You're not the teacher. Okay, you're a reader, and so that's the lens that you need to use to read and comment on your peers' work. You're a reader. Okay, you're an audience member. So as an audience member, is it working? Okay? Is that point getting across to you? Is the story clear to you? Can you keep track of when and where things are happening in their story, right? Where are you getting lost, or where does the writer kind of lose your focus or attention? Okay, so you got to think like a reader, not like an editor. Okay? And lastly, the peer review, as I said before, is usually done with early drafts, first drafts, maybe second drafts if it's a longer term project. But you write that first draft, you give it to somebody to peer review to look at the ideas and the information, not to just tidy things up. Okay, and again, I'd say a lot of times, this doesn't happen in workshops in class. Sometimes it's because teachers don't give students enough time to work on a draft, or to like draft an essay, get it reviewed, get it revised, like they'll save the workshop for like the day before it's due. And that's just you're I think that's just setting students up for failure right there. That means that all they're going to look at is the grammar and the mechanics. So not to knock teachers, because I know there's not a lot of time in a class period, or even in a semester. But if you really want people to do a workshop successfully, you got to give them time. Okay. All right. So let's talk about. Oh, yep. There's my big red X. So we're not doing this, guys. Okay. And I'll talk more about that in just a little bit later. But we're not doing editing right now. Okay. We're doing this. Okay. So I want to share three key strategies for giving good feedback. And by the way, I should say here that you get what you give. Okay, so if you're the type of person who's thinking, I don't really care about this part, I'm not going to give them feedback. Well, just know that in the world of writing and workshops, karma is a thing. Okay, so if you give crappy feedback, don't expect good feedback from other people. Okay, so number one, I mentioned this before. You've got to read and respond to your classmates' work as a reader, not as an editor, not as a grader. So when you write your feedback, you should frame it as a reader. Okay, so tell the writer how you as a reader are processing, understanding, reacting to the writing. So instead of giving them a command like you should make your point more clear, tell them what's going on in your mind. So you could say something like, at the end of your essay, I'm still not sure what point you're trying to make with the story. Okay? Or instead of making like just a quick judgment, your essay doesn't have a point, right? You could say something like this. You could say, I think your story is really powerful, but I'm not sure what the essay is trying to say about you. Okay? And so right there, we can see the framing from a reader's perspective. I'm still not sure. Okay? I think your story is really powerful, but I'm not sure what the essay is trying to say about you. I'm not sure what point you're trying to make. Okay. Instead of like, let's say the essay, they tell a story, but the story is just full of details, and you're not sure, like, are all these details necessary, right? Instead of telling them to cut some of the details, or just saying, you have too many details. You could say, you've got lots of descriptive details in this paragraph, but I'm kind of getting lost in them. Okay? I'm not sure what's most important or where the story is going. Okay? Guys, even if this is all you do as a responder, just tell them like what you're thinking as you read and trying to be specific about it. That's better feedback than really. It's better feedback than no feedback, and it's better feedback than just telling them what to correct. Sorry. Let's say, And so instead of saying these details don't seem relevant, you could say, I'm not sure how these details relate to the point of the essay. Okay, so again, I'm kind of getting lost. I'm not sure. Those are all great sentence starters that you could use to write your feedback. Second strategy, be specific. Okay, we talked about one of the complaints that people often have about workshops is that the comments are really vague. They're not telling the writer enough. So let's say you really enjoyed their opening paragraph. You thought that they started off with a really gripping story that got you hooked, right? Instead of just saying, I love this paragraph, or great intro, great opening paragraph, go into a little bit more detail. Say, I think opening with the story is effective. Although it might have too much detail, it does a good job setting up your conflict. And right there, that's the specificity. That's the explanation. Okay. What you're doing there is you're telling the writer why you thought that paragraph was effective. Here's why I think it's effective. Guys, why do we do this? Why do we want to elaborate even on our praise and not just on our constructive criticism? Well, as I said before, praise is good, but when we explain the praise, why we think something was effective, why we liked something, what we're doing is we're helping the writer understand what they can continue to do in the future. Okay. Um, Otherwise, they are going to be left guessing. Okay. Here's another one. Oh yeah, one of the things I tend to see in first drafts of these sorts of essays is that they spend maybe like 600 words of the essay telling their story, and then at the end they just kind of put their point there. So after all this, I realized blah blah blah. Um, and that's something you don't want to do. You don't want to just tack on a point at the end like it's a fable, right? And the moral of the story is, um, instead of just saying this, you could say, I enjoyed your story, but I wasn't sure why this mattered to you until the very end. You might try adding some reflection or analysis after the description of blank and blank. Okay. Um, so you could say, again, so this highlighted portion is where we are explaining why, what we mean by this. Point feels tacked on. Well, this is really what's happening in our minds as a reader. We're not sure why this matters. So, for 2/3 or 3/4 of the essay, I wasn't sure where you were headed with this. My third suggestion is, and this might seem trivial, but guys, it's really not. Okay, the way that we phrase our own suggestions is actually really important. Okay, remember one of the complaints was that sometimes students feel like their classmates are trying to rewrite the essay, and sometimes that's because the way that those suggestions are framed. So my third piece of advice here is, when you are giving suggestions for what they could do differently, how they could write something differently, what they could add, what they could delete, use the word could and not should. Okay? You could open with this paragraph instead, because these two sentences seem to say the same thing. You might consider, right, or you could cut the second one. This sounds like a cliche. Maybe instead you could write something like, and then give them the suggestion. Okay. So instead of saying, well, you should do this instead, you should cut the second sentence. You should open with this paragraph instead. Okay. What we're doing here is we're trying to make sure that we are giving each other choices. Okay. Not directives, not commands. The more choices we have, the more we feel like we are in control of our writing, the more empowered we feel to make it better. Okay. So just be careful how you phrase your comments. The other thing that you could do instead of giving a suggestion is to ask a question. I actually think that, depending on the problem that you're noticing, questions can be more powerful than suggestions. So here are some examples of that. Right? I've seen essays that end with like 2 points or 3 points, right? And so you could point that out, right? It feels like you're making 2 different points here at the end of the essay. Then you could ask the question, which is the most important? Okay? That turns it back on the writer, and again, it prompts them to make a choice. Okay. Plus, it just gets them thinking about the problem that you're seeing. Gosh, this story feels disconnected from the others. I noticed this a lot too in college application essays. You telling multiple stories, and they don't really feel connected, right? So you could ask the question, why did you include this story? Sometimes they have a reason for doing it, but then maybe they just don't explain that reason. They haven't connected those stories clearly, and so this gets them thinking about that. Hopefully, then they'll maybe go back and be more explicit about that, right? Or I inferred that this is the reason. Is that accurate? Okay. Oops. You're telling me that this experience changed you, but I still don't know how that happened. Can you elaborate on the story a little more? Or how would you elaborate on the story a little more, right? You can get even more specific, right? If let's say you could say, for example, what did you do when, and then talk about a part of the particular part of the story that they're telling. Okay. So again, asking questions is sometimes just as good, and say sometimes even better than giving them suggestions for how to change something. Okay, so here they are in conclusion. In summary, give a reader's perspective. Okay, frame your comments as use that first person pronoun. I thought this as I was reading, or I'm not sure about this, or I kind of got lost here, or I really liked this because, right? Be specific and explain your feedback. Okay, don't leave your comments vague. Even if you're giving praise, explain why you liked that, found that particular thing effective. And then lastly, give the writer some options. Don't kick them out of the driver's seat and take over. Okay, say could, not should, or even better, ask questions. Okay, I just want to end with some final tips here. Number one, what I like to do, especially with these essays, because they're so short, I like to read each draft once without making any comments. Okay, and that can be sometimes hard to do, but read it once, just as a reader. And this what's good about this is that first time you read it, you'll go through, and then by the end you'll have kind of a basic understanding of what the writer's trying to do. Okay, if you start commenting after reading the first paragraph, by the time you get to the end of the essay, you might realize that your comment was kind of out of context. Okay, so wait until you get to the end and then go back. And also, what this does too is it'll help you strategize, because you don't want to comment on everything. Okay, one thoughtful comment on the whole essay or per page, one long specific piece of feedback is better than like lots of little things along the way. So read it once all the way through, get a sense of what the writer's trying to say, and then maybe strategize, plan what comments you want to make. Okay. Second tip, try if you can to think like a college admissions officer. That's sort of the real target audience of this essay, or will be. Okay. So an admissions officer is going to be looking at this essay to try and get a better, more specific picture of who this student is and how they stand out from other students, and how they kind of stand out from the numbers on their transcripts and the data that they get from their letters of recommendation and their other resources. Okay, so how well does this essay stand out from the other ones? Based on the essay, does the writer come across as thoughtful, as curious, as passionate, as motivated? Okay, do you get a sense of this person, even if you know the person? Like if you had to just rely on this essay, would does this essay really speak to any of these important characteristics? Third, try to take a bird's eye view of the essay, at least at first. So don't get mired down in just like single paragraphs or sentences. Before you begin commenting, think about the bigger things. Okay, and I'm giving you guys a list of kind of questions or guidelines to help you as you go through each essay. But the first thing you want to think about is the point. Okay, just like in an academic essay, the thesis. Okay, do they have a point, and do they make the point well? Okay. And then you can kind of work backwards. Well, they have a point, but the point is the point doesn't really seem connected to the story. And then then you can say, okay, well, here's where the story kind of goes in a different direction, that sort of thing. Think about the story itself. Okay, does the story have enough detail? Do they do too much telling and not enough showing, or do they do too much showing? Do they just kind of get off track, describing everything? Think about the structure. Okay, is there a conflict? And if there is a conflict, do they develop it? Is it do they have a conflict, but they try to use a 5-paragraph essay format, or vice versa? Do they not have a conflict and they try to use a story structure? Should they use a 5-paragraph essay format? That kind of thing. So look at the bigger things first. Okay. Fourth, if you're going to address any grammatical errors, you can do that later. Don't start with that if you can. Okay. Now, here's the thing: don't avoid it altogether. If you come across, especially if they're making the same mistake over and over again, point it out once, but don't keep pointing it out over and over again. Okay. You should definitely look for wordiness, because we've been practicing that. But again, maybe save that for after you've commented on some of the bigger things, right? And then lastly, instead of commenting on everything that you think is important, I would say consider making only one substantial comment per page, and that will help you. Um, that will make things a little more efficient for you. Plus, I think it's more effective for readers. If they have a margin full of comments, it just gets a little bit difficult to navigate those. But if each of you just addresses one thing, and then maybe make some suggested edits throughout, that would be effective. So consider that. Okay, there's my tips. Again, these are the 3 strategies for giving good feedback. So hopefully, this written workshop will be a little bit more effective than maybe some of the other ones that you've had. Okay, that's it. Thanks, guys.